Rome triumphed, but the history books, those carefully curated narratives we consume, deliberately omit a truth so brutal, so utterly dehumanizing, it threatens the very foundations of the empire's glory. Imagine, for a single, harrowing moment, you are on a dusty road in 70 CE. In the distance, the triumphal column of legions returns to the eternal city. Banners snap in the wind, soldiers march in impeccable formation, and amongst them, chained, are hundreds of women, their eyes vacant. Women who already know that death would be mercy compared to what awaits them. This is an account of what truly happened when Roman legions conquered a territory. It details the grim fate of war prisoners and practices that transformed military victory into something far beyond mere territorial domination. What you are about to discover is not fantasy. It is documented in generals' letters, in the writings of ancient historians, and in judicial records, preserved for 2,000 years.
Yet it has been meticulously omitted from school textbooks and grand cinematic productions, because some truths are simply too uncomfortable to be taught. The books teach us of Rome's glory, of the invincible legions that conquered the known world, of generals returning in triumph, parading along the Via Sacra while the people cheered. They speak of war prisoners displayed as living trophies of imperial power. The official narrative is simple. Captives became slaves. They toiled in mines, on farms, in the homes of patricians. It was the natural destiny of those who lost a war in antiquity. Brutal, yes, but an accepted part of the Roman world order. This is the story that prevails, clean, organized, convenient. But the documents tell another tale. According to a military report preserved in the British Museum, dated to the reign of Trajan, after the conquest of Dacia in 106 CE, approximately 15,000 women were captured.
The official text merely mentions their distribution among the legions and subsequent dispatch to the provinces. Distribution, a word so bureaucratic, so neutral, until we read the personal accounts of soldiers, the letters sent home, the diaries found in abandoned fortresses. Then, the word distribution acquires contours that no contemporary historian dares fully detail in university lectures. Because what happened to these women before they became domestic slaves was a ritual of systematic humiliation, a celebration of victory etched into the bodies of the vanquished, a political act disguised as military savagery. But can we truly call it savagery when it was calculated, organized, and sanctioned by the Roman state itself? When a city fell, there was an established sequence. It was not chaos, it was method. First, men of combat age were separated, killed immediately, or reserved for the arena games.
Small children and the elderly were categorized as useless, left to their own devices, or eliminated according to logistical necessity. Young women constituted the third group, and they received a special treatment. They were gathered in the conquered city's central square, stripped bare, exposed to the sun and the gaze of the entire legion. There they remained for hours, sometimes days, while officers made their selections. The most beautiful were marked with red dye on their left shoulder, reserved for the commanders. The rest were handed over to the common soldiers. There is a specific Latin term for this, preda bellica feminarum, female war spoils. It appears in military manuals, in official correspondence, in tax records, because yes, there were taxes on this commodity. A fragment of a letter found in Pompeii, written by a legionary named Marcus Flavius during the campaign in Germania, describes the scene with disturbing coldness.
I took 3 for myself on the first night.
The youngest cried without stopping. The second tried to bite. The third merely looked into nothing, as if she were no longer there. I preferred the third. She was easier. Easier. That word echoes through the centuries because it reveals something fundamental about the nature of this violence. It was not motivated solely by desire. It was about control, about destroying dignity before destroying identity, about transforming human beings into objects even before formally enslaving them. Roman generals perfectly understood the political function of this ritual. It was not merely about allowing soldiers to vent after months of campaigning. It was a demonstration of absolute power, a clear message to any people considering resistance. This is what happens to your daughters, your sisters, your wives, when you defy us. And it worked. Tacitus, the Roman historian, wrote about Boudicca's revolt in Britannia in 60 CE.
Hay mentions that Boudicca herself and her daughters were publicly violated by Roman officers after their capture, not as personal punishment, but as a necessary example to establish imperial authority. The warrior queen who had led her people against Rome was reduced to a spectacle. Her daughters, princesses of royal lineage, were transformed into a lesson in obedience. When Boudicca finally rallied her forces to rebel again, she was not fighting merely for territory. She was fighting for something far more primitive: vengeance for the irrecoverable, for the dignity that could not be restored, for the silence imposed on screams that no one heard. She lost. And what happened to the women of her tribe after the final defeat was never fully recorded. We only know that Britannia did not rebel again for 300 years. Is silence always a sign of peace, or merely of a terror so profound that even the voice is stolen? But that was only the beginning. After the first days, after the ritual of domination, came the bureaucratic part, the transformation of people into property. The survivors were literally branded with a hot iron. A symbol indicated which legion had captured them and the specific campaign. Scars of ownership engraved in the flesh, often on the face, so they could never hide their condition. Next, the transport. Chained in groups of 10 or 20, they marched hundreds of miles to the ports. There they waited in damp, dark warehouses, the same warehouses used for grain and olive oil, until enough ships were available for transport. A commercial inventory preserved in Alexandria, dated 115 CE, lists a mixed cargo of a merchant ship: 340 amphorae of wine, 120 barrels of wheat, 89 women from Judea, 14 Berber horses. Women among wine and horses. Same inventory value, same logistical category. The sea voyage lasted weeks. They traveled in the hold, chained in rows, with no space to lie down completely. The daily ration was calculated simply to keep them alive, nothing more. Many died of disease, dehydration, or simply gave up breathing. Their bodies were thrown into the sea without ceremony. There is an economic calculation preserved in a Roman treatise on property management written by Columella in the 1st century. He estimates that the acceptable rate of loss during the transport of female war prisoners was between 20 and 30%. Acceptable, as if discussing the deterioration of fruit. When they finally arrived in Rome or other large cities of the empire, the auction took place. Specialized markets where wealthy men examined the merchandise as one selects cattle. They felt, inspected teeth, forced mouths open, checked for signs of disease or pregnancy. The youngest and most beautiful fetched stratospheric prices.
They were bought by patricians, by luxury brothels,
by temples that offered special services for worshippers of certain Eastern deities. The others, those who had lost their beauty during the journey, those who carried too many scars, those who showed resistance or madness, were sold in lots for mines, farms, or factories. There, life expectancy rarely exceeded 5 years. But there was a fate considered worse than the mines: the lupanars, specialized brothels that operated in all Roman cities. These were legal establishments, regulated, taxed. The Roman state profited from every transaction, and female war prisoners were the most sought after by clients. Why? Because they were exotic, because they came from defeated peoples, because violating the enemy's daughter gave ordinary Roman citizens a sense of participation in imperial glory. A man who had never wielded a sword could for a few coins feel like a conqueror.
A graffiti found in Pompeii, scratched on the wall of a lupanar, reads, "Here I penetrated a Briton." Rome is eternal. Even the most intimate act was transformed into a political declaration. The women in these places had no names. They were called by their origin: the Gaul, the German, the Jewess. They worked in cubicles of less than 2 square meters, without windows, with only a curtain for a door. They served between 10 and 20 men a day. There was no retirement, no escape. Many resorted to suicide, others went completely mad. Some, very few, survived long enough to become libertai, freed slaves. But even free, the mark on the face remained, the memory in the body remained. A Roman physician named Cyranous of Ephesus wrote a treatise on gynecology in the 2nd century. In it, there is a chapter on common diseases among war prostitutes.
He describes chronic inflammations, premature infertility, recurrent hemorrhages, then adds, almost as an aside, "It is advisable for owners of lupanars to renew their stock every 3 or 4 years, as after this period, the merchandise loses commercial value and productive capacity. Renew their stock, as one speaks of broken jars. And all this entire industrial system of dehumanization, operated openly. No one hid it. No one was ashamed. It was simply the natural order of things, the logical consequence of military victory. Rome won, and the vanquished paid with everything they were and everything they could have been. One must ask, how much of this calculated coldness still persists in modern wars, merely under different names? The veil of silence shrouds history's darkest corners, a meticulously woven fabric designed to obscure the inconvenient truths that challenge our cherished narratives. Behind that door of historical quietude, something even more chilling lurks: the near absence of first-person accounts from the victims themselves. They left no written testimonies, these women. They didn't know the conqueror's language, had no access to writing materials. And who, among the victors, would bother to record their words? Yet rare, precious, and profoundly disturbing exceptions exist. In the 2nd century, a woman named Blandina is mentioned in early Christian writings. She was a slave, originally captured during a campaign in Gaul, who converted to Christianity while serving in a Roman household. When discovered and imprisoned for her faith, during the interrogations, she spoke of her journey. A fragment of her account echoes through the ages. "They asked if I feared death.
I answered that I had already died many times before, that they killed me the night my village burned, that they killed me on the march to the sea, that they killed me in the ship's hold, that they killed me the first time a Roman man called me property. Death before the lions would merely be the confirmation of the obvious." Blandina was executed in the arena, but her words endured. They reveal a crucial truth. The trauma wasn't merely physical, it was existential. the destruction wasn't just of the body, but of the very notion of humanity. These women were forced to learn a terrible truth, that the entire structure of dignity, identity, and human value they knew could be instantly revoked, that it was merely a convention maintained only as long as there was military force to sustain it. When Rome triumphed, that convention ended, and once shattered, it could not be rebuilt. Even liberated, even escaped, even decades later, that fracture remained.
Because it was impossible to forget the fundamental revelation: you are only human as long as someone stronger allows it. Another document, this one from the 2nd century, mentions a slave rebellion in a villa in Spain. These women killed the owner and his family during the night. When captured, the leader, a Germanic woman, referred to only as the red-haired one in the records, said to the judge before her execution, "You taught us that the world belongs to the violent. We merely practiced the lesson." She was crucified along with 17 others, but her phrase resonated because it exposed the central hypocrisy of the system. Rome considered itself a civilization. It believed it brought order, law, and structure to the barbarian world. Yet this very civilization was built upon systematic violence, upon the methodical exploitation of the bodies and souls of the defeated. And when the defeated applied the same logic of violence in retribution, they were branded criminals.
The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 5th century, recorded a revealing moment. During the invasion of the Huns, which finally began to dismantle the Roman Empire, he described the attitude of some captured Roman women. Strangely, many seemed to accept their fate with resignation, as if recognizing in it a distant echo of something their own ancestors had practiced. Historical karma manifesting itself. Rome harvested what it had sown for centuries. But this redeemed no one. It did not save those Roman women from the same horror their ancestors had inflicted on others. It merely proved a cyclical, nauseating truth. Humanity possesses an infinite capacity to transform the pain of others into a system, into tradition, into normality. And when that system crumbles, another merely reveals itself, waiting in the wings. Can we truly say we have evolved? Or have we merely changed the clothes of the same cruelty?
History books rarely dedicate more than a paragraph to the fate of war prisoners in antiquity. And when they mention women, they use vague terms: enslaved, exploited, forced into compulsory labor, neutral words that conceal specific, insufferable realities. But there is a reason for this careful silence. As the Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg wrote, "The line separating the sacred from the profane is thin, and almost always drawn by power." Rome became a civilizational model for the West. Its legal structure influenced all modern legal systems. Its military organization served as a basis for contemporary armies. Its architecture is still imitated in capitals worldwide. To fully acknowledge the systematic nature of Roman sexual violence would be to question the very foundations of that admiration. It would be to admit that civilization has a cost, and that cost is always paid by the most vulnerable. So, we prefer the elegant silence.
We prefer to focus on the aqueducts, the roads, the laws. We prefer to celebrate Julius Caesar as a military genius and forget that his campaigns in Gaul resulted in the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of women and children. We prefer to watch movies where gladiators heroically fight for freedom, but we never see what happened behind the scenes of those arenas. We never see the lupanars beside the Colosseum. We never see the queues of men awaiting their turn with newly arrived prisoners. because it would be too uncomfortable. But discomfort is precisely what we need to feel. There is a gravestone in a London museum dated to the 2nd century. It was found near what was a Roman fort in Britannia. The inscription simply says, "Here lies a woman, her name forgotten, her land also. May the gods have more mercy on her than Rome had." No name, no story, just the anonymous recognition of a suffering that could not be named. How many others like her existed? Millions, certainly.
Over 6 centuries of imperial expansion, countless women went through the same process. Born free, they were captured, violated, enslaved, forgotten. And their individual sufferings became mere statistics in military reports, numbers in commercial inventories, footnotes in history books that most people never read. But each of those statistics was an entire life. It was a girl who had a name, a family, dreams. It was a woman who loved and was loved. It was a complete human being, reduced to an object by men who believed they had the right to do so simply because they won a battle. And this did not happen in a single day of fury. It happened systematically, methodically, for generations. It was not an aberration. It was state policy. The French anthropologist Pierre Clastres wrote that war is not the failure of civilization, but its foundation, that every state is born from the capacity to organize violence on an industrial scale. Rome proves his point.
Because it was not the collapse of order that generated those horrors. It was the perfect order. The machine functioning exactly as designed. Soldiers doing their work, merchants doing business, citizens frequenting legal, all within the law, all within normality. And perhaps this is the most terrifying lesson of all. It was not monsters who did this. It was common men operating within a system that told them it was all right, that it was natural, that it was just. How many current systems tell us the same thing? How many contemporary cruelties are justified by necessity, by security, by order? When we walk through the Roman ruins, the grandeur of the engineering, the beauty of the architecture, the sophistication of a lost civilization.
But if we listened closely, perhaps we would hear other sounds on the wind. The screams that no one recorded, the pleas in languages no one cared to preserve, the cries of millions of women whose names didn't matter enough to be etched in stone. They built Rome as much as the engineers and the generals did. They built it with the sacrifice of everything they were, with the destruction of everything they could have been. And they left no monuments, no temples. They left only the silence that fills the gaps in the history books. Yet silence, too, is a testament. The Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert wrote, "The ones who lived in those times were no worse than we are. They simply didn't know what we will yet discover. But did they truly not know? Or did they know perfectly well and simply choose not to care? Because the accounts existed, the documents survived, and anyone who wanted to know could know. The Romans themselves recorded everything with meticulous bureaucracy."
The issue was never knowledge, it was always complicity. And when we today choose to celebrate the greatness of Rome without mentioning its foundations of suffering, when we teach young people about the glory of the legions without speaking of what came after the victory, when we watch films about emperors and gladiators and conveniently forget the rest, do we not also become complicit? Do we not perpetuate the silence that began 2,000 years ago? The truth is, We prefer comfortable myths to disturbing realities. We prefer simple heroes to understanding that almost all human greatness comes at an obscene price. We prefer to believe that those times were different, that we have evolved, that we would never do the same. But we do, in other forms, with other justifications, in other geographies. Sexual exploitation in war zones did not end with Rome. The reduction of human beings to marketable objects did not end with Rome.
Systematic violence against the defeated, the displaced, the refugees did not end with Rome. It merely changed its name. And as long as we choose to look at the past only to admire its glories and ignore its horrors, as long as we choose to learn from history only the lessons that make us feel good about ourselves, the echo of those screams will continue to resonate, not as a warning we heed, but as a prophecy we insist on fulfilling. Have these horrors truly remained in the past, or have we merely learned to hide them better, to justify them with more sophisticated words, to perpetuate them in systems so complex that they allow us not to look directly at what we do? Is the difference between us and the Romans moral or merely technological? And when you close your eyes at night, when the world falls silent and only your conscience remains, can you hear the echo? Or have you learned, like generations before you, to transform screams into whispers so faint they seem part of the wind?
Power in any era always finds a way to sanctify its own sin. The question that remains is, will you continue kneeling before that altar?